In this tutorial, we're going to show you how to choose content from the DLS, or from anywhere really, that isn't too performance heavy on Trainz itself when you're using it in your routes. So first off, let's start by opening up Manage Content, and then while you're in here, you want to right click and insert some columns, so the author's name, so you can know which ones to focus on who have some good content. Open up the build version, is always handy. The higher the build version, the more likely it will have additional functionality and features like LODs, and it's probably evolved over the time since 1.3, which is the original one. So 4.3 is the current one, so anything with 4.3 might be a bit better than the previous stuff. Type will tell you the type of object that you'll be using. It's got nothing to do with performance, it's just a handy one to have in there. And you can add any more that you want there, probably installation date, so you can filter on when things were installed, so that if you install something from the DLS, it'll show up as the latest date and you can find it easily. So once you've got that there, let's take a look at some assets in Content Manager. What you can do is you can right click, you can go to Preview Asset. This will bring up a separate window that you can expand a little bit, and you can see what that asset looks like. You can also tell what sort of object it is, so it's Flora there, and you can probably determine whether it's a spline or not. This is probably a spline. If we open it up, edit text file, we can see it's kind as a track, so it is a spline. So we can stretch that across and stretch that out to infinity, so it creates a nice grass spline. So what we're looking at on the right hand side here is we've got the mode, which I'll come back to in a second. We've got LOD distance. This preview asset window is a good way to determine what one particular asset, or how heavy one particular asset will be within Trainz. So this is a good analysis of an object in Trainz. So we've got mode, I'll come back to. LOD distance, so this is automatic at the moment, so you'll see as we move back, this is meant to be changing how many triangles and draw chords it's showing, but obviously this asset itself doesn't actually have any LOD. So this has no lower levels of detail. What you see is what you get all the way to infinity, or your draw call, your draw distance, which is your settings in Trainz. So there's no LOD, doesn't matter. I'll hit it to 5,000. Oh, I lie, sorry. It does eventually stop rendering. So I would say that in the config, at 1,000 meters, it's still rendering at the highest LOD. At 2,500 meters, it's now switching off. So eventually, if we get to somewhere, it's going to switch off. There we go. The triangles and draw chords will stop rendering, and that will be in the config itself. In the tree LOD, track LOD tree, it's saying at 250 meters, use the high and low detail, and then after 250 meters, go into here, and it says at 500 meters, use this high and low detail. At 500 meters, use this high detail. Else, outside of 500 meters, it'll go and drop into this container, and it'll say at 3,500 meters, use the mesh still. Otherwise, use nothing. And so after that supposed distance, it's saying I'm going to turn the mesh off. So that's not bad, and considering it's only 512 triangles, it's a fairly okay LOD. But you know, when you're at this sort of level, which is still, I would say maybe a kilometer away, maybe even less, 512 triangles is still too high. You can't see all those triangles. It needs to be a lot less than that. It could be one, a few, just to make out there's a bit of grass. Anyway, this still going through these stats. The triangle count obviously tells you how many triangles or polygons you've got there. The draw call count tells you how many materials it's using. This one's using 1, which is great. You're not going to get much less than 1, unless you're probably using a color perhaps. but again, it still probably needs to draw something. So one's good. A lot more than that you want to try and stay away from. And then you've got animation count, bone count, attachment points, all the rest of it. So they're also fairly low. But these two here, your triangle counts and your draw counts, are the main one you'll be focusing on. Now, going back to mode, you can actually do a performance analysis where you hit that button and it will render the splines out for you. So it'll go off to infinity and it'll give you a triangle count and a draw call count if there was that much stuff on the screen. So right now we're at 4 million polys, and now we're getting to 5 million polys and nearly 600 draw calls, and that's probably way too many for this particular object. You want it to be lotting, or at least not being drawn that far back. So as you can see, you can't even see it, and now it's still increasing. So yeah, it's not the most efficient asset in the world, but there are a lot worse ones than this, so you really need to pick your battles on which stuff you're going to use. And obviously you won't be using it this dense, but still you'd be looking at, a lot of the tracks that we've made internally don't go over 100 draw calls when there's this much on the screen, and we'd be below probably 500,000 triangles. So this is pushing nearly 12 times on the triangles and probably nearly 7 times on the draw calls. So this is a way to analyze each asset anyway. So what you want to do is you want to open your assets up in here and really analyze them and say, is this an asset I want to be using in my route? And depending on how much you want to be using it as well, you'll be able to determine from within here. So let's take another look at an asset. First, I'm going to just turn on, if we turn on our DevTools, enable advanced DevTools, just close down Trainz for a second, load him back up. Once you enable that, you get a lot of development options here, and one in particular that you'll want to use is the Show Profiler. This one has a render FTP setting and a game thread, FPS, sorry, not FTP. Which is the frames per second, and this is going to tell you how fast the frames per second is running. So if we open that back up, this is a way of gauging how performance hungry each one of your assets are. Let's turn on these again, build and type, and I've started a list of, well, this is what everyone should do when they're making their routes, is you should start a list of content that you want to use in your routes, somewhere around here. Here it is. And here you can find that these are the ones that I would probably not use. These are the ones I definitely wouldn't use, and these are the ones that are good to use, which I've determined by analyzing them in the preview asset window. So let's have a look at some of the ones that I wouldn't use, and I apologize to the content creators. I had to choose an example somewhere, and unfortunately these were the ones that I found. So this is by no means trying to paint anyone in a certain picture. It's just demoing a particular asset. So this one in particular, I've gone preview asset on this one, and I've had a look at it, and it actually ended up being a speed tree asset, which is great. And we zoom in, and we get a lot of detail on there, and I thought that looks really good. But then I took a look at the triangle count, and this one particular asset is 674,754 triangles to draw that one asset. So that is, you would never want to use this asset for performance reasons in your route, because it's just way too intense for that, just such a small asset. So that's why you need to really look at the assets you're downloading and determine whether it's worth using it or not. I mean, this thing should be well be under 500 polygons, and it's 700,000 polygons nearly. And then you've got 11 draw calls, which means there's 11 materials being used on that one asset. So that's fairly high for draw calls as well. It mightn't look high compared to the triangle count, but 11 different materials is still a lot for such a small asset. You would expect, you know, a big loco or an engine to have 11 maybe. That's still pushing it. That's a lot of textures or individual textures / materials that you're using there. You can fit all this easily into a small texture, which would be one draw call. So analyzing your assets before you actually use them is definitely a good way to determine what content you're going to be using. The other thing is, if you do use some content like this and you're finding that your performance is struggling a little bit in the route, then you can definitely fix it quite easily. And we'll show you that in a second on how to determine, after you've gone through with the effort of putting everything down in your routes, and some performance starts to struggle because you might have used assets like this which are pretty performance hungry. There's ways around it and quite easily to fix it. So let's have a look at another one as well. This one here I've actually had a look at as well. So drop that in here. Sorry, preview asset. And again, you know, quite nice asset. We've got trees there all lined up, but what should be about, who knows, maybe 12 to 50 polygons perhaps for each of these. Each of them make up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Each of them make up about 10,000 polygons each, because we're at nearly 200,000 polygons for just one line of these, and 5 draw calls. So there's 5 materials or textures being used on those trees. So this is another asset that you really wouldn't want to put in your routes, not from the look visually, just from the performance reasons. So if we inspect that, which I'm a bit reluctant to do because I know once this gets stretched out, my computer's probably going to crash. So again, you really need to analyze these and just check out what's going on with the asset. So preview asset, I'll leave it at that. Preview asset is a really good tool to inspect what's going on with your LODs manually or automatically as you zoom out. And this one doesn't have any LOD, so we've zoomed right out, and I'll show you that. We've zoomed to 10,000 meters, and at 10,000 meters we're still rendering the highest LOD. So that's a problem asset, that one, for performance. And then you've got seasons. You can change for winter and altitude. So 0 to 4, you can have a look at those, and the asset will change if there's winter set in its config, and you should see it changing here. And then you got the rest of your stats you want to look at, especially animation count and bones. Make sure that if you've got something that animates, take note of that, because if you've got, you know, 200 bones in an animation, it's probably going to be a very inefficient animation. So let's leave it at that. Let's go into our route now, and we'll take a look at what happens if we have used. Well, let me just turn that off. What happens if we have used an object in our route, and maybe we'll start off with a blank one. If we've used an object in the route and the route's running really slow, and it's really hard to work out why that is. So what you can do is you can go up to settings, and you can turn on your general settings, show performance stats in Surveyor. So if we turn that on, we'll get a whole bunch of stats here, which might be slightly harder to see. And each one of these are going to give us some information about what we're rendering on the screen. Right now we're not rendering much at all, so we don't really have too many problems. Let's go to that problem asset. If I remember correctly, it is perhaps that one? No, this one. So as soon as I put this down, you're going to see the stats change. And what the stats are telling me is the worst buffer count is this particular CUD, which is saying 4, and a worst index count, which is your polygons, and it's saying it's 845,022. So you know, as we put more of these in, you can see the counts change, and we're now at 3 million polys with just those few objects in there. That's 3 million polys. Is you should be seeing a whole detailed route for that, not these small assets here. So that's a problem. And because this is a speed tree asset, you can see that as we move back, it's now gone to 1 buffer count and 96 polys. So it is dropping fairly fast, but there's no way you still need all that kind of detail, that many polygons with that particular asset. So that's a very poor asset, unfortunately, for performance. It looks nice, and it does load fairly quickly, which is I guess a plus, but you still wouldn't want to use something of that heavy for such a small, I guess insignificant object in your route, because remember, it's just a small little flower. You're going to have a lot more stuff in here. So again, if we take the other asset, which I believe it was a spline, this one, and we start to run that out, you'll see that what's happened now is the worst buffer count is 20, and the worst index count is 2.5 million, I believe. 1, 2, 3. Yep, 2.5 million. And it said, well, these trees don't matter anymore. But as you zoom in, it goes, oh wait, no, these are the worst buffer count, not these ones. So it definitely is useful to zoom around your map, and whatever's on screen, it will change to say, well, this is the object you should have a look at, because this is the problem one. So right now it's saying this spline is definitely the problem one, but as we zoom around, if I was to draw a little spline over there, you'll say, right, the spline's still the problem over here because it's in view. But as we move over, it's saying, oh, actually no, this spline isn't the biggest problem. These flowers are the biggest problem because they're 3 million polys and 21 for the buffer. So that's something that you want to just take into account. And if we were to place a few of these around, you're going to see your performance or your FPS really start to suffer, which we'll bring that up again. Now we're looking at 32 frames, and this machine is actually meant to run really well at 60 frames. So now we're at 28 frames, and that's just with a couple of splines and some high polygon objects there. And you can really see my machine starting to struggle. So that's the difference between finding good content that performs well and finding content that's really going to suck the life out of your machine. So what happens if you put this everywhere, if your machine even could run, and you're now looking at the object in preview asset and going, oh wow, I've used that everywhere, and I wish I didn't, because that's the problem. Like the stats in Surveyor are telling me I should have had a look at this asset a long time ago. So what you can do is you can easily just go to, let me just turn off the stats. You can go into main menu, bulk asset replace. You can find your spline asset, you can put it in there and replace it. I'm going to look at hedge 01. Just say it was fairly similar. I'd go into here and I'd go hedge 01. This is after I actually knew that this was the asset I wanted to use. And I'd open it up, I'd have a look, I'd go, okay, 304 triangles at that distance, and obviously it would look the same if I chose it. Draw calls are 5. It's still not the greatest, but it's a lot better than what I'm using, obviously, because the 304 is better than 700,000. No, 700,000 is that other spline. So I go, yeah, okay, that's the one that I'm going to use. So I drop that in there to asset replace with, and I hit begin, and there we go. It actually updates. You can see my frame rate is a lot faster now because it's now not having to render all those draw calls and also all those polygons. And that's a quick and easy way to take a poor performing asset that you've analyzed and found through the surveyor stats and also using preview asset, and it might give you a 10 to, who knows, it might give you 1 frame per second increase, but it's worth replacing if you can really increase that, because that's half your battle, is trying to make sure your beautiful routes run really well so people can experience them. And again, you do the same thing with the any other assets. So once that's been replaced, you'd turn back on your surveyor stats, and then you'd continue moving around the route. And it's you've got to get quite close to some of these things, because right now it's still telling me that those flowers are the problem, which is great. But as you move back, you're going to see that the splines will become the problem, but they're not really a problem. There's 2 buffer count, and there's only 21,000 polygons being drawn there, so that's not a problem at all. But as you move closer, you see, oh wait, something just jumped up to 3 million, and that's no good at all. So that's when you'd replace. You'd find the asset in Surveyor, you'd type in the keyword, and you'd go, right, I know what that is. You'd then type in the name, and you'd bulk replace that. So I hope people understand that concept in replacing things that are making their routes really slow. And there's one more final tip that I want to show you. If you jump back into the launcher, we've enabled the dev tools before. You can go to show render buffers, and these render buffers, provided you don't move your camera, the camera's stationary, whatever's in the camera that you're looking at now, when you go to view render buffers, it will show you everything that the game is actually rendering in that viewport. So you can see that I've got oh, sorry, that's the profile. You can see that I've got, let's just make sure we can still see that for frame rate. I mean, we're at 60 frames, so you're not going to see any bigger performance, but in the render buffers, you can see everything that's being rendered. There's not a lot. You're going to get a lot more in the render buffer when you've got a really detailed route. But what you can do, you can see that this keyword here, I know, is the problem one. You can see it there. You can just, if you were getting, say, 30 frames a second, and you just wanted to see what performance you would get if you did replace this asset, you can select all the buffers for that particular asset, and you can hide buffers, and it hides it from the scene. You can instantly see that the worst buffer counts change to our spline, because that's the only thing being rendered now. And you'll see, definitely, if you've got a frame rate issue, your frame rate will go up. And if you want to just sample that off and on, you can right click and go show buffers, and it'll show it again. So then you'll see that that's the worst buffer count again for those particular assets. So this render buffer count is very handy with turning your problem assets on and off as well, just to preview it in runtime, to debug your routes if they've got any performance issues. So there's just a few handy tips to help you guys out with checking out the assets that you are getting from the DLS or third-party content that you don't know about and you haven't made yourself. And if you do move again, if your camera moves, your render buffers are now void. So you close down the render buffer window, and you'd go back to your launcher, show render buffers again, and it shows you the render buffers for what else is in the current scene. Those flowers are still in there, so if we moved over a little bit more, you'll obviously see them. You won't see them in the render buffer. So there you go. It's just doing a mesh in that spline, and that's it. So I hope that's helped you guys get a bit more understanding on looking at the content that you're using in a bit more detail to determine whether the triangle counts are correct, the draw calls are correct for your routes, and the way you want to use that content. So it'll give you a bit more of a understanding on what might be the issues in your routes performance-wise and how to fix them. If you've got any other questions about this, please put them on the forums and we can answer them or create more videos if needed. Thanks for watching.